Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a VES-Artex Academy webinar. Today, we're talking with Dr. Wolf, and we're talking about the cost of calves. So we are going to just do a little bit of housekeeping at the beginning here. You've got a question and answer section at the bottom of your screen where you can ask questions at any time. We will be looking at answering these at the end of the presentation. You can also send your questions through the chat feature. And if we don't get to any of your questions, then we will connect with you after the fact and Dr. Wolf will email you. So for now, I'll turn the floor over. Thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Well, thank you all who are attending this afternoon. Take time out to visit with us here a bit. And I'm hoping to bring some value to it, to try to put in context a bit about really what is the costs of respiratory disease in calves, as well as some solutions. And often that the solution for calves seems to be a very, very least cost of effort. And I'm trying to give you some ideas of rather moderate or modest ventilation investment can really have some huge returns for the dairy. So we're going to start first with just some of the concepts of why and how we're trying to ventilate the calf environment. So again, from the time that calf is born until it leaves the dairy, we want to make sure that whole lifespan is properly taken care of as far as environment goes, that meets that animal's need, both to grow well and perform well and have a high welfare environment. So again, we want to take care of that through that whole life cycle. It's a whole lot longer investment than what we generally see in other ag industries like poultry or swine in terms of length of life cycle. So again, this calf lives in this microclimate. He's 70% of his day, he has his nose about 6 inches or less off the floor of his environment. And so that microclimate is where we really need to focus our ventilation strategies. And we'll talk about that as we go through this. So today, these are the 5 C's that Dr. Sheila McGurk at the University of Wisconsin has developed in terms of things we have to focus on, and it goes across, colostrum and the calories and the comfort and the cleanliness and consistency, which are great points, and each one of them have things to be fleshed out in them. But today we're going to focus on the center one that has to do with comfort regarding bedding and ventilation. So the goals of a calf housing in general, we want to provide a consistent fresh air across all seasons, especially in more temperate climates where we have wide swings in extremes, and that the barn will be responsive to that. We want to temper those extremes with mitigating the external environment conditions, whether it's too cold or too hot, and it also has benefit for employees that are working, with the calves. By preventing rain and snow from getting driven into these barns, we're not dealing with bedding becoming wet and creating issues for the calf's health and welfare. And then we want that to be a consistent airflow at the calf bed. That helps dry the bed, helps get ammonia out of that environment, and doesn't draft the calf at the same time. So we'll address some of those ways of doing that. So when it comes to the goals of an indoor calf housing on a seasonal basis in the wintertime, again, we want to properly ventilate that calf's microclimate. We don't want to draft him. And I'll give you some targets that I regard when I'm measuring air speeds and airflow in the calf's environment. In the summertime, we want to create that airflow to help with heat stress on that calf. When it gets above into the 70s or so, the calves will start to experience some heat stress, and so we want to cool them. And then by moving air over this calf's environment, flies don't like to hang around in that environment. So again, we help with some of those issues that can come with the pests that are in the barn. In transition times, we want to make sure that is being adapted up and down as that environment changes. So again, number one goal, we got to get fresh air in, the oxygen. We need to remove the humidity that's being created in that barn by all the different sources, whether it's from the calves or things that are being done in the barn with water that adds to the barn humidity. We need to be able to control that and remove it from the facility. Again, there's other gases that are being produced. The primary one, a big one with calves, is ammonia. And there's other ones that are not routinely measured, but methane and the CO2, carbon monoxide. There's aldehydes that come out of bedding from different components in it, as well as we got the bacteria, molds, and endotoxins that can be coming out of that environment that we want to remove from it. And then the dust and what are called a fomite is actually a particle that's very small that can get pulled deeper into the lung tissues, and it's going to carry along with it not only itself as an irritant to the lungs, but the bacteria and molds and stuff that are attached with that can help increase the risk for respiratory disease. So in preserving that lung capacity, it's hugely important, because if we lose that, we're turning down the draft on the biological furnace. The animal has to get oxygen into the lungs to be able for it to grow and thrive. And if we reduce the lung capacity, it's not going to be able to perform to its optimum. Again, that has a huge effect on the weight gains and height, how soon it'll enter the herd, and how long it'll stay in the herd. Again, when the lungs are damaged and we end up with abscesses in the lungs, that's something that'll carry in that whole animal's life, and they may break or come out further down the road and cause chronic issues with the animal. Again, anytime we're reducing that lung capacity, and the bovine as an animal has got a smaller lung capacity versus its body size, say compared to a horse, because of this large rumen that pushes the diaphragm forward, and it kind of reduces that capacity of the respiratory system. So we want to make sure we're preserving it at its maximum potential. And again, the costs that come with treatment and culling. Again, that's just an example of some that are happening inside that chest that we don't realize at times of how much lung we may be losing. There's some examples here with, this is a mycoplasma lung here that has all these fine abscesses that animal will carry its entire lifetime. This animal here has got emphysema from having its lung compromised, and the air is actually outside the lung tissue and not inside the regular tubes that carry air to and from the lungs. And in this example here in the upper right corner, that's a pleural adhesion where the lung from inflammation has actually attached itself to the body wall, and that's going to inhibit how easily that lung can expand and contract. And if you know anybody that's ever had pleurisy, it is a very painful sort of condition to have. And so again, impacts that has that are kind of unseen to us that's going on inside that calf. Just cover a little bit, these little cilia that here, they're in this picture here, is actually the cleaning mechanism that brings the mucus and the dirt and bacteria up out of the lungs. And so we want them to be active, and things like ammonia in that environment can inhibit the activity of them, as well as virus that kill these cells. And that's how bacteria, viruses can end up further in the lungs and actually cause a respiratory disease. So again, let's talk a bit about ammonia and humidity. That air temps tend to be higher in any facility toward the ceiling than what they are at the floor, because just the thermal buoyancy wants to make that air rise. And so the relative humidity is going to be higher in the building than what it is down at the floor. Again, if we imagine that calf with his nose 6 inches off the floor, what he's experiencing in that environment. So the cooler temps, in any place is going to increase the relative humidity, and that humidity is going to be higher close to the floor because of that thermal imbalance between the higher up and down at the floor level. So then if we go on to the ammonia follows humidity. So again, if we have higher ammonia humidity levels at the calf level, the ammonia levels are going to be higher too. So these are targets that we try to hit for calf environments. We want to be below 5 parts per million. If we're above that, we're going to start seeing some feed efficiency reduction. If we go over 10, the average daily gains go down, and there's a definite impact on increased pneumonia risk. And the goal is to stay under that 5 parts per million. And there's relatively inexpensive sensors that can be added into the control system that can monitor that, in a facility to indicate just how well you're controlling that with your ventilation system and how you're managing the barn. This is an example. I always say, put your nose where the calf's nose goes. This is an example barn. We have a fair amount of litter buildup if you look at the left-hand portion of this slide. And so we have quite a bit of bedding mass that's built up there. And so I'm taking an ammonia level right down there at that bedding interface. And if we look at the center picture, again, I'll often get down to my hands and knees and just see what are these calves experiencing at this level. And if you look at that one small calf here to the right here, he's got his nose right on the bed. So that's what those calves are experiencing. And we definitely want to ventilate where that microclimate is. The other point to be made, if you can't kneel down like I am in that calf pen is not dry, and you need to be addressing your rebedding schedule. Because if you wait until a pen looks like it needs bedding, you're probably at least 24 or 36 hours too late on your rebedding schedule. In this particular barn, we're at 22 parts per million, at the level that I was examining in the slide represented. This is a slide or ammonia sample from a calf barn that a friend of mine that was in a barn, and he was just astonished that this was 75 parts per million, which is hugely above what, and people get used to this and they don't realize that this is the level of ammonia that's going on in their facilities. So again, when you got to ammonia mitigation, we want to be below that target. So you need to actually have something to monitor that if you can. And we have to create drainage. The more you can get moisture away out of the bedding, get it into a focal area and get it removed from the building has a huge impact on the ammonia load that's going to occur in that building. Generalize, we don't want to use supplemental heat in calf barns because you end up in this no man's land if you're trying to stay above freezing, maybe to 50 degrees. The battle will be between your wallet and how much heat you want to put in that building versus proper ventilation. And the only way that you'd be able to achieve that, if you want to use heat for that type of climate or environment, you're going to need to have an air exchange, like a air-to-air air exchanger. And I know facilities that have done that, and it is successful. But again, it's another investment in order to achieve that level. And calves can do quite well in colder environments. Again, if they're properly nourished, they're out of drafts, and they're on a dry surface, has a huge impact on them being able to handle any sort of cold environment. So again, if we go on the long straw, we increase nesting score, so the animal's losing less heat into the environment by being able to nestle into that. And another huge point on ammonia mitigation is, removing that bedding every 2 weeks, especially in auto feeder barns where these calves are drinking a whole lot more fluids and there's a lot of protein that's coming out. Those type of diets are going to add to that ammonia load. So we want to be sure that we are removing that litter very frequently, and 2 weeks seems to be the optimal from the people that I've interviewed with these different types of calf barns. Has a huge impact on that environment for the calves. So again, the prevalence of respiratory disease, it starts after into the second weeks, and right around 7 weeks, which is generally the time we're starting into the weaning process more, is when we're going to start seeing those spikes. And again, this is looking at a prevalence of 15%. The Heifer Raising Association, Dairy Heifer Raising Association has a target of 10% or less on their targets for that group. And again, these are more the more intensive people in the heifer raising industry. So those are the targets we try to achieve or less. And I've been in dairies where they're down at less than 2% on both death losses and diseases of respiratory disease with properly ventilated barns, as well as all those other factors that are pointed out in Dr. McGurk's 5 C's kind of focus. So we're going to talk a little bit about natural ventilated barns. Again, we're back to relying on Mother Nature. So it's which way is the wind coming at the dairy, what's the intensity, and how long is it moving. So these wide variations create wide variations on the inside as well as the outside. And at times, and I'll show you some examples that sometimes we have almost like a bathtub effect where we're not really affecting the airflow down at the animal level. The air may be ventilating up higher, but it's not really getting to the animal at where he or she is living. So again, we look at the local farm topography, are there windbreaks? Are there surrounding hills? These more compact farm sites that are quite often seen buildings have a huge impact on how calf barns ventilate, and just putting another shed right next to a barn can have a huge impact on the proper ventilation of that calf barn. And it's something that people don't necessarily realize when they're doing things and trying to fit things in. The building design parameters, the pitch of the roof, the eave and sidewall height, how much the ridge opening, all these things have to be taken into consideration. And again, we're still back to that, the variation. And if we can do things to put it under more of a control system, then rather than somebody, do I go out and turn up the curtain or down, there are control systems that will allow to adjust either fans and or curtain inlets automatically, so it kind of takes the human factor out of how you control that barn. Again, natural ventilated, we like to see that oriented perpendicular to prevailing winds, and we don't like to see roof pitches below the 312, and preferably 412 is more optimal for better natural ventilation. And the roof openings, we look at that 2 inches of opening of the roof for every 10 foot of width of the building, and 1 inch of opening on the eaves, again, for every 10 inches or 10 feet of width of the building, so that we're kind of able to get that air through the building. And once you get beyond, say, 40 feet of width, that strategy starts to fail. Again, if we look at the thermal buoyancy versus a cow, like 1,500 pound cow is producing about 1,500 watts per hour. So that's about 5,000 BTU. If we look at a 100-pound calf, it's not ruminating. It's doing a lot of just resting and not moving around that much. It's like maybe a 30 to maybe 50 watt bulb. You're not really creating a lot of thermal buoyancy off these calves to drive ventilation down at the animal level. So this is a barn. This is actually in the UK. It's a friend of mine's family dairy. And you can see how the buildings are quite, I'm just going to put it up here. But you can see the way the buildings are, and let me go to the next portion here. The winds are coming from this direction, and now they've built in 2 more barns to the west, and the calf barns are in the center of this picture. And so they're getting obstructed as far as how well that airflow is occurring to where those calves are. So again, we need to take into consideration how the external environment and position of buildings and things like lagoons and silage piles and things like that can have an impact on the air quality in these calf barns. There we go. There's our 2 buildings that were added. So here's a natural ventilated barn, a very nice facility. We got lots of calves in here. And this is in a more temperate climate. I was here in December. And if you look in this barn, there's no bedding in this barn. If you look at the picture to the right, there's quite a few sick calves in here. And I asked the dairy, when's the last, did they just clean this facility out? And they said, no, we haven't cleaned this out in 3 years. And their strategy is to let back wall the curtains open, and Mother Nature, because the intensity of the dry winds coming through there, actually blows the bedding or the manure out of this building. So encouraging them to use some straw to give those animals some thermal insulation from the cold ground is not in their strategy at all, because the barn cleans itself. And so it's how sometimes we get misfocused on what what's best for the calf and not for the ease of what we're doing at times. And so, so again, the wind's coming from here, and they have a huge number of ill calves because of that. So again, let's talk about drafting airspeeds. That calm air is generally considered to be kind of less than that 80 feet per minute. It's about 4.4 meters per second. And down at those speeds, you need a hot wire anemometer to really test of what's happening at that calf level. Down at that 6 inches or less is where I like to focus. And so your vein type anemometer is not going to give you an accurate reading at that level. So I like to target between that 30 and 60 feet per minute at the bedding level. That is not going to create a draft on the animals. Adding a calf jacket is going to just increase that any sort of drafting effect. And the bedding score, if you do use a calf jacket, it's going to bump it more up one value if you do use a calf jacket. So again, my clinical observations, when we start dropping below 30 feet per minute in that animal's environment, the risk of respiratory disease goes up dramatically. So that's where I generally focus on what's going on at the calf level and not at the people level. In summer, we want closer to that 300. That helps us dry the bedding, cools the calves, and it deters flies. So these are some standards that the University of Wisconsin Dairyland Initiative promotes for the thermal neutral zone for these calves. And again, the bedding scores, again, these are at their site if you want to go visit that, is what a 1, a 2, and a 3. So the more those animals can nest into that, it has a huge impact on the amount of what they're losing. So if we look at a hybrid tunnel barn that we're trying to move air through this barn, and as an example, is what we're going to do here today. We've got different combinations of neutral and partial neutral barns. And so we're going to look at an example of one here. But first, we're going to cover a little bit of economics. This is actually looking at the top line. The red is actually the barn temperature. The middle line is the dew point in the barn where the calves are. And the bottom line is the dew point outside. So this is during November, December. And that middle line, you can see the dew point in the barn never matches the barn temperature. So then we're not getting condensation and high humidities that may be problematic for the calves. So for feedings, we'll pass over. This is an example of a tunnel barn. There's some exhaust fans on the end to pull air through. They have some skylights in here, but we have an exit or an entrance here. It's got an eave on it to prevent water getting pulled in. And this is working very successfully in the UK environment. Ceiling fans is a way of mixing air within the barn, and they've been included into the strategies. So that'll destratify the air. It doesn't create air exchange. It just basically mixes the air in the animal's environment, helps dry the bedding. And again, it has more of a limited value in a naturally ventilated system because winds will have influence on how that fan's going to work. Here's an example that was done on a barn in the UK, and this can be done in any barn anywhere, but there's fans that are pushing the air into the barn that are varied by what the conditions are required. And then the ceiling fans push the air down into these areas where these calves are. And you can see that even if the air is coming through the sidewalls here where the space boarding is or below it, this tends to be just a bathtub of where air is going to be stale. And by mixing that air and forcing fresh air in, we have a much improved environment. And this had a huge impact on the respiratory disease in this particular barn. Here's another barn that's using a more aggressive strategy. These are post-wean calves. That's a tunnel ventilated barn with recirculating fans that are in that strategy. So if we start looking at what are our targets for growth, and if any of you want to take a screenshot of any of this or just a picture with your camera so that you got this, we're not going to go into this in great detail, but these are just targets for what we want to see in terms of how these animals are growing and how well they're doing. Again, these are from the Dairy Calf and Heifer Association standards. So the impacts of respiratory disease, we got lower average daily gains. We have increased labor costs, increased drugs, lower weaning weights, delayed puberty, more services per conception, longer days for all these things add up to more costs into that heifer before she actually gets a chance to enter the dairy operation. And that adds costs to the and taking away from the bottom line. So here's an economic model that this is from Dr. Mike Overton, who now works with Zoetis, but was at the University of Florida. These are the animals. If you'd like, go ahead and take another screenshot of this. We're not going to spend a lot of time going through each one of these details, but this is the background of what they were targeting in doing this study. So again, if we don't have any respiratory disease compared to with, that our mortality risk at 22, almost 23 months is only 8.2% of that animal being culled, and 6% of that 8% is from reproductive culls. If we go with respiratory disease and compare that, the risk now we have longer days to calving. We've added almost a month to that, and we have higher on-feed, feed costs before lactating. And if we compare the two, the culls, including the respiratory disease and the repro, at 16.4. So we have a higher risk of being lost from the herd, and a lot of that comes from the respiratory disease. So again, we're looking at the cost of BRD, which is bovine respiratory disease on culls. The earlier we can identify animals to remove from that, the better it is for the system. So at weaning time, at about 6 months of age, pre-breeding, and then at pre-calving are probably where you should be looking, and preferably those 3 earlier times is a better time to decide, should this animal remain in the herd. That's going to be your cheaper cull to remove that animal because it's not performing with its peers. And the idea is to reduce the number of animals that you have to make that decision on. But again, those culls made earlier are a whole lot less costly than the one that you do once they've entered the herd and they don't survive the first 60 days or first lactation. That's a very expensive cull. So again, these are the things we want to look at. And so out of Dr. Overton's work here, we came up with the $266 for the milk loss and the culling loss, the expenses of treatment, and all that are involved in. So that's what we're going to use as our number when we look at the cost of a ventilation system. So the example of a controlled environment, we came up with looking at 10 years of historical data, looked at the temp. That's basically, it's a West Central Wisconsin site is what we're making this on. The example, it's a 1,000 cow herd. We're looking at 50% heifers, and we're figuring we got 96 spaces that'll take animals through 10 weeks of age. So we're going to look at the cost per space and the investment in that ventilation system. So here's a controlled environment calf barn. We're looking at both the potential for individual or paired calving groups, if we will like, or even more expanded groups. We're targeting 40 square feet of living space per calf. We're going to background them for 10 to 14 days. The barn's about 1,100 cubic foot of barn per calf, which is above the 600 target that's recommended. And here's our exchange rates of summertime versus the maximum in the wintertime. You're going 32 to 643 per calf. And the minute air exchange here at 15 and 2 minutes. So, and again, what we want to do is attenuate or change those settings as we go from cold to warm as to how fast this ventilation system will adapt. So this is our model barn, the 3D view. The exhaust fans are the colored fans on the far end there, and those are staged at different stages of when they would come on based on the ventilation rate required. The inlets here on the end are powered inlet with the blue with a central curtain, and there's some negative pressure sort of passive inlets that are at the peak and along the sidewall. So this is the design. The center purple dots are actually ceiling fans that are going to mix and destratify this air as it moves through that facility. So when we put the financial inputs in, the cost of equipment, the electrical installation, kind of bring all those costs together, and annualized, we have about almost $3,000 for electricity, accounting for a loan value at 10%, 10 years at 6%, and $280 for just maintenance that somebody's going to have to clean and maintain these fans also. So our breakdown came down here to $29.75 cost per day, or 31 cents per calf space. And so that's what we're using in our modeling for our economics here. So this is just a sensitivity analysis, and it turns out, if you look at the upper right corner here, that -8%, that's how much reduction from wherever we start from is what you need to make the break even for the investment in this facility in terms of ventilation costs. And so no matter where you start from, each 5% that you're dropping in your incidence is an improvement of that $8 per cost per calf. And so again, we're not saying that ventilation is going to move you from 45% down to 5%, because there's all these other factors that I talked about earlier that are in Dr. McGurk's focus on these calves, of how well we take care of them, and animal husbandry has a huge impact. But if this can be a huge part of that, if the facilities are in that sort of condition. If we're down toward the bottom end of this, where you say, well, I'm already at 10%, that means it's going to cost me money to help try to improve this. And then you start getting those ancillary things of employee comfort, and that they're more likely to attend to details because they're not worried about standing out in the wind, the rain, and cold conditions perhaps, or out there in the heat of the day, that they're more attentive to the animals. So there's those ancillary or kind of things you can't necessarily put a dollar value on, but it does have a huge impact on how well the animals do. And I've been on several calf barn facilities lately here, and these people are down in less than 2 and 1% death loss and respiratory disease rate. So it has a huge impact on those barns, and they're quite pleased with the investment that they made. And again, we're coming from the idea that there's a whole lot more. In that example I showed you early, a very modest investment can have a huge impact on that animal's environment and help quite a bit with its health, welfare, and productivity. Oh, so I got these little active things in here that I forgot. Anyway, so the goals of that indoor housing, we want to make sure we provide consistent fresh air that's in its microclimate year round. We want to ensure that there's air exchange rate, to remove those bad things that are in that environment. And then we want the airflow at the bedding. We want to help dry it. We want to get the ammonia out of there. We don't want to create drafts, and there's ways of measuring that to ensure that we're doing that properly. We want to cool that environment for those calves in the summer, and it helps to reduce those flies that are in the environment. So other intangibles that we have: enhanced calf welfare in temperate climates. Again, you have a facility that by automated control will ramp up and down as conditions are required. You got a better working environment for the employees. And again, we trying to mitigate those external forces that are that the calf as well as the employees are working with. And just working with sick calves does take a toll on people's mental health. And it's very frustrating when they seem like they're doing all the best they can. And maybe it's just that environment that they're living in is having the parts take over the balance of how much they have to deal with. So I know one of the dairymen that I visited, he said that his people are happier, and that's huge to him to be able to retain employees because they appreciate the working environment they're in. So again, the issues that I thought, the welfare and productivity, employee concerns are alleviated, and so it's a bit of maybe a whirlwind tour there, but I'm trying to get the concept here that really look at what sort of a cost in terms of some active ventilation strategy, and looking at the impacts and how much that investment could really return hugely with a minimal amount of capital investment. So I appreciate your attention, and any questions you might have, I'd be more than happy to entertain. And I guess I'll turn it from there over to the folks. So I appreciate your attention, and
thank you very much. We greatly appreciate your talk. I think it was well received. I do have a couple of questions for you. The first one, is there a special trick to removing bad air from the floor rather than moving air far above the bedding, especially in problematic enclosed facilities?
Well, the best way is trying to get airflow down there, and that has to be controlled. So again, as I said, not to draft those animals, and there's various ways that have been used to do that. Tubes have been one way, but there you have to make sure the tube directional flow is directed to that area. And actually, once it's installed, it should be checked again with a hot wire anemometer to see how well are we getting that airflow to the bed, because that's one of the things that I have seen, that failure to get air into that microclimate has a huge impact on the respiratory disease incidence. And that's where, with the ceiling fan, using that on smaller designs, and again, that's adjusted for, as you get bigger facilities, more aggressive fans, but again, they have to be controlled so that we're not drafting those calves. and that works well. But again, those fans are not creating air exchange. They are destratifying and mixing, so you're using the whole barn volume, but you have to have an air exchange strategy. And that's where getting a little bit away from the idea that Mother Nature is going to take care of that, because she's not very dependable. And this is a way of taking a little more control of that microclimate where that calf is. That's where the focus is, that we're not ventilating barns, we're ventilating calves. So hopefully that answered that question. If not, I'd be willing to take a follow-up question.
Awesome. Our next question is, knowing how well outside calf hutches work, why consider building a barn? Is it worth the risk, and who can help minimize that risk?
Again, it goes back to, you know, like I say, the one dairy I was at, that the more automated barn was working great for him. And he said, my hutches always worked, but my employees, I was not able to retain people because they said they don't like working out there in those conditions. And that does take away from their attention to calves, that depending on the facilities and how well the other kind of ancillary issues outside of ventilation and bedding can have a huge impact on it. So what we're trying to do is take each one of those areas and minimize their impact on that. And one of those impacts is, you know, how well people are willing to work in that environment. Again, it's more of a challenge in these more temperate climates, and that's why that type of facility. But I would say, even as we go further south, that idea of actively moving some air over calves still is not a bad idea, because it helps with drying the bedding. It does help bring fresh air down to the animals, and a lot of it depends on how you design your barn. If you have more individual stall areas where that calf is in like a box more, the boxiness of his environment has a huge impact on the air quality where he is. And there's been research that we didn't cover in this presentation of looking at how much that can have an effect on respiratory disease. So more open design is better, but again, you open up to more nose-to-nose contact. But I found in facilities and people that have well managed, you know, top to bottom approaches, that nose-to-nose contact becomes much more minimal, because you don't have animals actively with disease and chronic recovered carriers being involved directly with other animals. So again, the lower the disease incidence, the whole lot less the problem is of nose-to-nose contact.
So what is the best ADG for heifers bi-monthly?
I think that is going to go a bit beyond, and some of that is in part of the presentation above. That was part of it. So if they want to go back and review some of those things, I think that goes beyond the scope of what we have here today, but it is addressed up further, and I kind of skimmed over some of that as far as targets of animal weights and what their freshening weights are as compared to the mature animal in the herd is the standard. So that is mentioned earlier, but I skimmed over it because there are specific numbers and targets that we have to look at. And I don't know if we have the time to go back and look at that slide, but we could definitely, to that person, if they do have a contact, we could send them that information. So
absolutely. If it would be possible, we'd love to get a slide deck from you, a PDF of it, and we can send that out to people as well. So the next question is, what airspeed do you consider a draft?
Again, that's in the presentation, that generally I want to be, you know, a mile an hour is 88 feet per minute. And I've looked at research that has stated as high as like in the middle 70s. If it's lower than that, it's not a draft. And so, and I've been and measured a lot of facilities, and anywhere between 30 to 60 feet per minute at that bedding level, I do not consider a draft. An animal that's well fed as far as nutrition, so that they're gaining weight, the bedding being ampled to reduce that heat loss, you know, that does increase maintenance. and if it's dry. And so controlling the humidity, the bedding surface that's going to pull weight from that or heat from that calf's body. And then you add a calf jacket on top of that at times on the more intense time. That's not, in my mind, drafting a calf. And I've had a number of facilities that are working great that even if we're in that 60 feet per minute, those calves are doing fine. And so that's where I'm kind of I've done a lot of dairies that once we start seeing increasingly as you get below that 30 feet per minute, that calf is sitting more in a dead spot and the respiratory diseases is just higher. And so that's where we gotta ventilate in that microclimate where that calf is, especially at that 6 inches, you call it a foot or less down to that bedding, because that's where that calf's nose is 70% of its day, especially in that first couple months after it's born.
Thank you. If you have questions, I'd just like to ask that you put them through the question and answer section at the bottom of your screen. Our next question is, what are your thoughts on a tube system for each season, winter and summer? Is it possible to have an adjustable calf tube for transitional times of the year?
There is strategies where people have done that, where they have a winter and a summer tube. Again, there's more expense that's involved with having those two different systems in place. And then it goes back to how do you control of when do you shut off the top one and when do you start the lower one? And again, how well does it actually get that air down to the animal level? And that's where Mother Nature, if you're doing a barn that may have those challenges, that it will shear off the tube airflow just because of and it'll happen even with the ceiling fans that I showed you, that closing up and controlling that lateral wind speed lets the barn work more properly. But now there are some facilities that with the same tube or where they can change it where from a summer to a winter sort of strategy. But again, the thing with the tube or whichever method you use, you have to get, in my mind, that airflow down to the calf in its microclimate. And that's where I've seen tube systems fail, was because we didn't get the ventilation down where the calves are, excuse me. So again, it's not that it can't work. It's just that when it's designed, it should be checked out by somebody that's knowledgeable, whether it's your vet, your nutrition people, to see, is it performing the way it should? Because there are times when the design doesn't measure up, and they can still have some issues that are related to the ventilation. So that there's different ways to go to town. The system I was showing you, more the idea that we can ramp up and down depending on the season, and still get fresh air to the animals and actively exchanges, is why that tends to be a preference. But again, there's a number of options that people can choose from. But whatever you do choose, look at both the effectiveness as well as how well is it going to function, and just the example I was showing there on your investment versus the costs of just living with respiratory disease that may be affected by your ventilation.
Follow up to that, is an exhaust strategy important with the tube system?
I like to actively see that, because especially when you close that barn up, given that air that you're pushing in somewhere to get out of that building, I think is a good strategy, because I've been in barns that we smoked, and because of the way the wind was hitting that particular barn design, that smoke just stayed hanging down low. It didn't move out of the barn, and I'm scratching my head, why isn't this moving out like we'd expect it to? And when I stepped out of the barn, I noticed which way the wind was hitting that barn. It was kind of a monoslope sort of shed design, and basically Mother Nature was pushing air in through that inlet that was supposed to be the outlet because of the wind direction, and was basically ventilating more of the top of the barn and not really down to the calf level. So the smoke kind of hung down low instead of having a place where it could actively exit. So again, with that strategy, the tube bringing the air in is distributing that. but having it for sure, being able to get out of the building, that you can't always, again, rely on Mother Nature to be play fair. And so again, that's what we're trying to mitigate some of that. So again, those are all discussions you should have with your veterinarian, your nutritionist, and people that are involved with the dairy industry and calf barns to give you some advice, and you can weigh the pros and cons of each one of those approaches.
So do louvered fans cause much airspeed over the beds, or can they be used in calf barns?
Yes, we do use those fans, but again, they need to be on a VFD or some type of control system. And generally, when we do install those, again, we look at the installment and the direction of those louvers, how they're presenting that air. And we didn't get into this presentation, but I do have videos that show how that air comes off those fans in peak flow of the summer, of how it moves the air to the calves, and by adjusting those louvers and controlling the airspeed, that the air coming off that fan will tend to more come off and actually kind of float down onto the animals instead of being driven at them. So we've done a number of measurements on that and are quite comfortable with that design. Depending on the barn design and the room we have to work with and the age of the calves and all that are all taken into consideration when we're doing those designs. So yes, it can be applied, but again, it has to be applied, if I want to call it smartly, is what you need to do.
Is group housing worth the risk, or should calves get individually housed?
I used to feel that way, that they had to be, as a veterinarian in practice here for 42 years, that evolution of, if we do the things right, starting from vaccinating that dry cow, getting that colostrum collected cleanly and into that calf quickly, and all those things that I was telling you earlier, nutrition wise and these other management things have a huge impact. Group calving or group calves does not scare me or concern me as much as it did before, because there we were trying to use isolation basically as a band-aid over other failures, within how we raise calves or how we manage that neonate time. And folks that are background in these calves properly, maybe 10 or 14 days if they're going on to auto feeders or mob feeders, are having just tremendous results doing that, because they're generally past those real critical times, and these calves are just doing really great in those environments. And so and all the things that we've learned about how group calves learn quicker and adapt better, those things can't be avoided or ignored. And it also presents well to the public as an added benefit of these calves being able to socialize more. So I definitely think that's something that's promotable. But again, people have to have their system, every part of it needs to be working well. It's not something you just do and not pay attention to all those other details that make it successful.
Could we group housing, or could we use group housing for calves with natural ventilation, and how would you do that?
Again, it gets back to the challenges with natural ventilation. That's always a challenge, as to relying on Mother Nature to control your environment. So if you're going to say, I'm going to do that way, then generally we want a much narrower barn, so we don't have as much real estate that we have to ventilate naturally. And I think some way of bringing that airspeed, so we are ventilating with that natural ventilation. If it's not coming down to the calf level, then again, we're back to ventilating the barn, but not the calf. And whether that takes, if a person says, well, I'll use a tube system to get the air down to that. If you do that, make sure that somebody verifies that you are actually getting that air to the calf. That's my kind of number one concern I've run across over the years of the barns I've evaluated. And but again, that ceiling fan idea, it's not going to work well either, because you can't have Mother Nature blowing across it either. And so again, we're back to the idea that we're not controlling how we bring fresh air into the building and how we get it to the animal and out of there. So again, a tube will work to give you that at that minimal air exchange rate. And that's one of the things that's a bit of a frustration. Some installers put variable speed on those tubes, and that totally confounds the air distribution, how it comes out of those tubes. Even if it's a well-designed one, that it really follows up the dynamics. And again, that's another whole topic for another time. But again, as with anything, if it's not done correctly for where we're putting it, then we're going to see failures, and then folks become frustrated, that I did this and it didn't help things. But again, we also have to pay attention to all those ancillary things that go into supporting, that animal's health and well-being.
And our last question today is, what should the distance be between hatchets?
Between hutches, generally, if you're in that, I'd say maybe 4 feet, 3 to 4 feet. Again, that gets back to any contact between those animals is generally plenty enough. Because if you have many of them, it takes up quite a bit of real estate to do that. But if we're going back to where the idea of using hutches into a paired idea, using 2 hutches and a larger space, I think that's a great idea too, because again, if we're managing those calves right, and even in the hutches with bedding and nutrition and water availability and all that, I'm less afraid of that contact between 2 calves. I mean, I think we focused too long with that being the kind of the Band-Aid to other management things that are having a bigger impact than on the fact that the calves can touch each other.
We actually had another question come in, so we've got lots of questions today. If we focus on the 3 meters per second at calf level, what height would you advise from the floor level when using positive pressure tubes?
I want to correct it. It's not 3 meters per second, would be like 600 feet per minute. So I don't know.
That might be me. I might have misinterpreted that.
Okay, I just want to make sure that people are aware that it would be in that 0.15 to 0.3 meters per second, I think is what we're talking at the calf level. And again, I take it down there at that, where that calf's nose is 70% of the day. And to make sure that we're creating that airspeed, because again, in larger facilities, that's one of the reasons that the tube concept came into fore, is because people took calves out of hutches and put them in a pole barn, and it didn't ventilate well, because you just don't have that thermal buoyancy that drives the exchange between the cooler air coming up above and the calf down below. So that's where, if we're truly going to ventilate in that calf microclimate, we got to make sure the air is getting to them, because we can't rely on if the air comes into a certain level and then we're relying on that thermal buoyancy exchange to get it down to the calf. He's not generating that much heat for that differential to occur, and that's going to compromise what his microclimate is. So that's what I've used as my standard, is looking right down at the calf level and seeing what he's experiencing.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. If you had a question and we didn't answer it, we will respond to you after. Thank you again, Dr. Wolf. We had a lot of interaction today. That was great. And we will ask for a copy of your presentation, and that will be available if people would like to take a look at it. And yes, so thank you all very much.
Yeah, and I truly appreciate all those questions. They were great questions, and hopefully we answer them to your satisfaction. And if not, we're here. There's a whole team here with VES-Artex that can help you with that, that we have on staff here. So again, thank you for your time today, and take care.
Thank you, everyone.